Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 20th of October, and today we have some really important updates, important advances, beginning with Maximilianivka and then going a bit further north to the eastern bank of the Vovcha River and south of Selidover. Some really important updates from all of those particular locations. We'll then go northwards and look at Toretsk and also, of course, the Kharkiv front, where there's also a lot of drama unfolding. And of course, we'll look at some changes in Kursk, albeit in comparison to some other videos I've made this week, there aren't as many changes in that specific location. Where there are a lot of updates is specifically from the Kurakhove direction. So you could see that actually over here. And you could see the advance is marked in yellow over the past 24 hours. This is confirmed based on either geolocated footage or reports from Ukrainian sources themselves. And you could see that a lot of it is the aftermath of the very large Russian coalescing operation that occurred on the eastern bank of the river yesterday. And in that attack, the Russians were able to get control over 12 square kilometers of territory, largely undefended open fields, and made it all the way to the eastern houses of Zoriana, east of the river, of course, in an area where previously you had the operational control of the 21st Battalion of the Separate Presidential Brigade. And since then, the Russians have expanded and broadened their attacks to also include the northern outskirts of Zelana Druche. The Russian attacks over here come from two axes. First of all, you have a paved route from Zelana Persha, and then you have another paved road that branches out from the east. And if you zoom out, you can see it comes more generally from the fields and may actually be branching out from Krasnohorivka. So it is an important region. It serves as one of Ukraine's final outposts on the eastern bank. So you have, of course, parts of Zelana Drucha that are still under the control of the Ukrainians, mainly in the residential areas, whereas the warehouses are now in a gray zone. You also have Ukrainian holdings in Alexandropol that day by day become more difficult to control. You can see that all routes to the village are now cut off in the sense that the south, the road that leads from Hostere to Alexandropol has been cut off. The road that runs along Zoriana has also been cut off. So you have this two-pronged attack that could occur. And Alexandropol is simply just a very small town where a lot of fire can be concentrated and it doesn't require as much effort to storm and clear out. And so the chances for the Ukrainians to resist here for a prolonged period of time are very slim. As you zoom in here, there's also a crossing, and this would also really entail even further damage than just taking over one bank of the river. If these crossings are not destroyed and the Ukrainians cannot field a suitable amount of forces to hold on to the river line, then the Russian forces will, of course, pounce upon the opportunity to cross over the narrow portions of the river. You can see how narrow it is over here. We're talking about several meters only, just due to the floodplains over here really being larger in comparison to the actual water in the width of the water itself. And it means that there are opportunities for physical crossings or pontoon crossings, something of that sort. And Zoriana would really be at the vanguard of that. And Zoriana, of course, does have this defense structure on the northeastern entrance, where you have another bridge that the Russians could, of course, use feasibly. But then to the south, there isn't anything that we see on the publicly available satellite imagery. So static positions will be much more difficult to hold in that particular area. And that will also have implications for Kurakhove, because then you have a direct road leading from Zoriana into Kurakhove. And Kurakhove is a really important city. It is large in comparison to some of the villages here. It's located in high elevation, which extends all the way from the high elevation in Hirnyk. And then it also connects to even higher elevated regions along these landfills to the west and also located north of Vovchenka. So the Ukrainians really have a strong interest in creating a buffer around here and preventing direct entrances. So that's a full summary of what's going on with the final Ukrainian bridgehead in this region. But besides that, the Russian forces have now initiated attacks north of Hirnyk. It's not a full-on assault, as far as I'm concerned, into the center of Hirnyk so far, although due to the Russians being able to divert Ukrainian attention to several directions, it does mean that the base, the core of the Ukrainian defense in this general front, this Vovcha River front, as I refer to it, has sort of been divulged and moved into other arrays in order to hold on to those areas to a certain extent. So you had that with the attacks around Zelana Drucha. You had the attacks around Ostrivska, for instance. You had attacks that occurred around the Tsukuria region and then actually south of it towards Novoselivka and Izmailivka. And those were all very threatening to the flanks of Hirnyk. And so some of the attention that Hirnyk initially received when the Russians had originally taken over Ukrainsk it was sort of moved away. And that gave the Russians an opportunity to, at the very least, enter into the town through the northern approaches, including along this specific rail line, and also through some of the open fields, tree lines, really branching out off of the original geolocations that we got from this region, which indicated that the Russian forces were present in the school area and in some nearby houses on the outskirts. So now the Russians DRGs are beginning to clear out these regions. But in terms of an assault into the city center, we just have to wait and see whether that will end up happening at this point in time, because right now there's an increase in shelling, very significant shelling of Ukrainian positions in some of the larger structures. There are some industrial facilities, landfills, you have some factories, so all of that will be targeted. Some other structures, 3-story buildings, apartments. Also to the east, you also have this Russian advance, and in total, the polygon here amounts to 3.3 square kilometers. The one north of Hirnyk amounts to 2.25 square kilometers. And this is just the Russians further consolidating control over forested patches and fields that the Ukrainians simply did not have the wherewithal to maintain control over, and were simply too disconnected from the wider Ukrainian defense array in this area. So the Ukrainians really have coalesced around populated centers and some of their local strongholds, as opposed to, fighting it out in areas that are very exposed and are not really along the key logistical routes. And you can see the Russian operation here is multifaceted. It includes attacks along the eastern flank, because then you, of course, want to cross over the bridges. It includes pressure to pin down Ukrainian forces that could be sent elsewhere in the Hirnyk region, and then they actually begin infiltration. But then also to the west, you have these attacks on the flanks that are meant to put additional pressure from behind in an effort to strike the supply lines that remain, that send in additional equipment and perhaps reinforcements into the Hirnyk region, and also to then tighten the noose in an effort to force the Ukrainians out, to increase their, willingness to do so. And then also on the way out, of course, target them from forward positions. And you can see that with this yellow polygon over here amounting to 0.8 square kilometers. So the Russian forces definitely have advanced. And based on the measuring stick, you can see that they've been able to advance at a maximum 2 kilometers southwards. This shows that there was a strengthening of the Russian position, which I believe includes elements of the 114th Motor Rifle Brigade. But, there's plenty of units here. 27th Division is around here as a more general force. And they have been able to branch southwards, cut off the paved route connecting Izmailivka to Novoselivka. And from there, the Russian forces have an option. They can continue advancing southwards and put additional pressure onto the supply routes to Hirnyk itself. Or they could branch out. They could branch out into Novoselivka to undermine the Ukrainian forces that are currently trying to build a defense line between the warehouses west of Sukhornia and Kremenik Balka. And of course, as I said before, Novoselivka. Or they could go for Izmailivka, which is now in a very compromised position, push through the less dense regions of those houses, and then put pressure onto Hirnyk from the west, which would be very, very painful given the fact that it's already enduring very difficult attacks from the north. So those are all possibilities right now, and the Russians are able to afford to do that because there is not enough pressure by the Ukrainians. Of course, the Ukrainians here have a defensive posture, but they're not in an active defensive posture. There are certain regions where the Ukrainians do still have the ability to conduct localized counterattacks and threaten certain forward Russian elements that are pushing through tree lines on the ground, not just in the air through drones or through artillery strikes, but actually on the ground to push them back, sometimes done with armored assets. In this region, I just have not seen any indication of that yet. An area where we did see that was in Pokrovsk, where the Ukrainians proved that they had the ability to conduct active defense in certain portions of the battles. And that's due to the large amount of reinforcements from some really good brigades, including the 93rd Mechanized Brigade, that then gave them the manpower and resources needed to do so. But definitely around here, they have not displayed that sort of capacity. In this region, you have mainly the involvement of the 59th Brigade, and you can see some of its battalions over here marked as they are the ones actually in Hirnyk. You have a territorial defense unit that's been involved recently. It was moved in to help out. In fact, 46th Air Assault Brigade, really a lot of its efforts are a bit further south in the Maximilianivka area, which we'll get to in a second. And a few more TDF units. 68th Jaeger Brigade, they're not necessarily operating here. They have their own operational zone a bit to the north. It would be in the region that's in between Pokrovsk and Selidove. And this is a region that's very important. The fact that the Russians aren't advancing over here is a reflection that the 68th Brigade is, manning the region to a favorable degree. But then you could also say that the Russians are focusing on other parts of the front line that have yielded them more advances. But you have this like 8 kilometer strip of territory that really is dangerous because the Russians have open fields here, not a lot of defenses to face in terms of like static positions, and they could push through with armored assets all the way to this highway over here, which would lead directly into the Pokrovsk region and would also give the Russians really a massive flank to overlook Saidova from the north. So definitely there has to be some sort of garrison holding on to that region, but then it means that the 68th Brigade can't be used, and it is a rather strong unit in comparison to the territorial defense units to defend a bit further south in the Sukhornia and Hirnyk regions. Now, in relation to the elevation, you have the Ukrainians on a ridge that extends from Hirnyk to Kurakhove into the landfills marked in X. Then the lower elevated regions I'm marking in green for you guys. It includes the suburbs such as Izmailivka and extends into Novoselivka. Basically, that entire chain of tree lines is on rather low elevation. Of course, it goes without saying that the entire like immediate vicinity of the Vovcha River is on low elevation on both sides. And then also here, Kremena Balka, Voznesenka, and all of the surrounding fields that are in these hinterlands that don't have that many defenses, they're also on relatively low elevation. Same thing would go for the area over here marked in between the large part of the very wide section of the Vovcha River and Novoselivka, for instance. This is also a region that is on a relatively low elevation, and that would make it the perfect region for the Russian forces to fire upon once they set up permanent positions in the heights located around St. Basil's Mine and in the ridge that extends southwards in between Novoselivka and Izmailivka. Now, in relation to Maximilianivka, I forgot to cover it first, but you could see that the Russian forces have advanced 1.5 square kilometers, nearly taking over the entirety of the western portion, which I said we would, of course, mark based on geolocated footage. Well, now we have that, and it indicates a Russian advance of 1 kilometer. You can see the Russians actually raising a flag past Maximilianivka in the energetic, I don't know how to say that in sort of accent, energetic gardening community. And as you zoom in, that you can see that it is located at the eastern end of that agricultural community. So there is this sort of wide, it's actually diagonal almost, course that leads directly into the eastern outskirts of Kurakhove past that point. And along this route, the 05110 road, you have to the south this one section which is really strong, this large Ukrainian trench position, this fortress. But then to the north, there is nothing of note. There are a few houses which could be assaulted from the Ostrivska region, but not a lot of defensive positions that were built up in time for the Russian assault. So the Russians really have to concentrate their focus on clearing out some of these positions that could be theoretically used to fire upon an advancing armored column to push into Kurakhove. But now the Russian forces from the 158th Motor Rifle Division, they are, of course, discussing the clear-up process, trying to consolidate control over the entirety of the village and, cleaning up the basement so they could sleep there, bringing in the heavy caliber mortars so they could begin firing directly into Kurakhove. So all the preparation is now beginning, and before we won't see any sort of massive advance before that is prepared, I believe, just due to the magnitude of Kurakhove, due to the magnitude of the trench perimeter. Those are all things that need to be assaulted in a coordinated manner with a large amount of armored vehicles and BMPs accompanying the tanks to dismount forces, first in tree lines and in trenches, and then, of course, in houses. So the 150th Division, their soldiers talked about how they were able to engage in fierce battles in the center of the village, that they threw actual large mines, these large anti-tank mines, into houses to cause them to get completely flattened, as there were Ukrainian soldiers inside, including some with machine gun nests that were firing towards Russian forces. You had a lot of Ukrainian forces by the end of the battle retreating on their own accord, moving westwards towards the gardening community, and then engaging in face-to-face combat with Russian soldiers that were trying to chase them on their way out. You also had a few POWs taken, according to Russian media that was talking about the incident, but it's low numbers that weren't really specified. But all in all, now the groundwork is being laid for the eventual assault towards Kurakhove. I would say also look at the southern front over here, this large field plot, because there are some trenches and 2 lines of tree lines that have to be cleared by the Russian forces in order to secure their flanks and broaden the horizon through which there can be attacks launched. Now, looking at the Toretsk front, we're going to begin south of the Zabalka district, where we have an advance by Russian forces amounting to zero point 0.7 square kilometers. It is an advance that allows them to have full control over the electric substation that was contested for a couple of weeks. Also allows them to enter into this small gardening region. There were a few dachas around here and just largely shrubbery, so it's a good region for DRGs to push through. And that's probably what we saw with this video that was released by Ukraine's Predator Police Brigade. It's a part of their national police force that really is either concentrated here in Toretsk or around Vovchansk. That's really their two domains of operation. So Predator, their FPV strike killed a Russian soldier. The location is over here, and it shows the furthest extent of a DRG advance. I think this is being done for two reasons. First of all, it is an effort to undermine the final Ukrainian holdings in southern Zabalka, which are in this sort of salient shape. They are exposed, they're disconnected from the majority of Ukrainian positions in Toretsk itself now. But nonetheless, it is still a strong grouping because you do have this large neighborhood, and then to the east, you have this landfill. So those have to be taken under control, of course. And just south of the landfill, you have an area for DRGs to operate with this very dense forested patch. So I think we're seeing efforts to really go in that direction. But also, I think there is this western angle to this, because the western direction leads to the rail line that connects between Elipivka and Leonidivka. Before reaching that point, though, there is this vertical trench line that connects between a really large landfill, one of the largest actually in all of Toretsk, and it connects to the rail line. So this is a solid Ukrainian position, and it's actually rather narrow because you don't have many other routes to go through if you want to advance westwards. You can't necessarily go through Nelipivka directly and cross through because there's a Ukrainian presence there, and you have to fight your way through Toretsk if you wanted to cross westwards. So then what you're left with is passing through the regions in between, and that's where the Ukrainians really invested in building up their defenses, even before it became apparent that this would become a major part of the line of contact. So now I believe we're seeing the first Russian attempts to establish positions nearby to begin the gradual taking over of various strongholds. Some of them are scattered around. Some of them are actually almost diagonal in a sense if you're marking them with this line over here in green. So the Russian forces here would like to individually take over and isolate these trenches, hopping between them until they reach the main vertical section over here. And when you look past this point, it really is a large area with a chain of villages, which is supposed to feed into Toretsk, at least what remains of Toretsk under the control of the Ukrainians. And this is very important for Ukraine's rear. It's also being threatened directly to the south because of these Russian infiltrations with armored assaults that are pushing along the rail line. The Russians have now done this several times, and I don't believe they've been able to establish a permanent foothold deep into Nelipivka yet, but they are paving these routes, these sort of routes that go rather deep, and then in the future they could use those same ones to actually dismount forces with BMPs and clear out basements and houses. And then the fear would be a two-pronged assault coming from the south and also from the east towards these really important villages such as Petrivka and Shechir Benivka. Then in relation to Toretsk itself, we have this video here confirming just a minor Russian positional advance. It's from, again, the Predator Brigade. They just dropped grenades onto individual Russian soldiers in houses, some of them with their roofs just completely open because of all the damage caused. One of them in this local gazebo, so in the public park region, the Russians were able to enter. And now this creates a sort of salient almost for the Ukrainian forward positions along these roads over here, like Havrilova Road, and just a few of the private houses and duplexes. So those will now be at the center of fighting. Also, it means there's an expansion by the Russians away from the citadel itself, away from the core of Toretsk, and also going a bit deeper into the less dense portions of the city, into some of the private residential areas, actually towards this soccer stadium over here, into some nearby stores as well. So the battle is beginning to expand, and the Russian salient in the center of Toretsk is beginning to widen. Now, looking at Kharkiv, there are even deeper Russian advances into Kurakhove. Every single day we receive another marginal Russian advance over here, but over time that continues to add up. We've seen consistent Russian pushes ever since they took over Pischane, and that was around late July. Ever since then, they've been just one by one chipping away at Ukrainian positions in forested regions, in local roads, near the ravines, tree lines, whatever it may be. and they expanded in several directions, and they chose specifically regions that were not really marketed with very specific trenches. They were pushing just through a broad horizon of open fields. And you can see now how the salient is situated in a way where the Russians have not really taken over that many defenses, but their positions are really built in such a way where they can flank those positions. So the best example of that would be with the salient over here. Ukrainians were never assaulted head on, just directly south of Pischane, but they never had to be because the Russian forces now have very strong positions in Berestove and Pischane and to the west. And so the Ukrainians that remain here, these forward elements, they're going to be under a lot of strain from several axes. Same thing would go for some of these positions near Hushkivka, Novosinove, and then also its trench perimeter. Those will all be under threat from an eastern assault and from a northern assault coming in the northern direction. And then in regards to the advances that unfolded today, you can see it's an advance of 1.35 square kilometers. This is based on a geolocation as was recorded by the Ukrainian side, where they had one FPV drone drop into a certain region, or it may have actually been a Russian FPV that struck a certain location. But as the Russian FPV was flying in the air, you could see filmed in the video that there were 3 Russian vehicles advancing along a vertical road. I'm going to zoom in so you can see what road I'm referring to. The one that connects Kolesnikivka to Krukhilivka, and you can see it over here. The three Russian vehicles advanced from the previously known line of contact past these warehouses, past some of the private residential regions, and then made it to this specific junction over here that then has a road branching out westwards all the way to the basically eastern riverbank of the Outskirts River. And this is the furthest extent of a Russian advance based on geolocated footage. It means that the Ukrainians are in fact only in control of a small portion of the village, and that the Russians have access to this key vertical road that runs along the entirety of the eastern bank of the river, and in the immediate future leads directly into Zakhrizove and Bohuslavka. So all those regions will be, of course, under threat through that axis, where, again, the Russian forces really have invested heavily in attacking here, utilizing armored assets. Of course, you have to look at the northern vertical axis towards Kolesnikivka, because now that's going to be in the conversation. And more generally, the Russian forces are just working on clearing out the entire corridor here, connecting the northern and southern parts of the Outskirts River. We've talked about this really extensively, but now we're seeing it come into really clear view. And that's despite the fact that there were very coordinated and large-scale defensive efforts by the 1st National Guard Brigade, 77th Air Mobile Brigade, Achilles drone units. There was a whole host of units that were involved in defense here, and they were able to sometimes temporarily push back the Russians. But as you can see, the claims made by them earlier on over the past 2 days that they were able to kick the Russians out entirely from the village were inaccurate, as every single day we receive more and more video footage that proves the opposite, actually. And now looking into the future, you have to look at how the Russians will begin to operate south of Kupiansk. There were advances along this particular salient. There were advances along the road adjacent to the river. There were advances along the highway that comes to the west of Kislivka. All of that will have to be looked at more closely. And I'm, of course, going to do some analysis of that. And then also you have to look at how there's going to be a lot of threats to the rear of the Ukrainian forward positions located near Stalmakivka, for instance, in Lozova, and in all the trenches in between that are actually a good distance away from the front line. So that also presents a vulnerability for the Ukrainians. You can see that this particular trench line is about 10 kilometers away. I shouldn't say only, because it is a rather large distance. We're talking about the front line in such a key part of the fighting, and you could also see over here this distance is around 7 kilometers. So I do believe that the really groundwork is being shaped in a way that will be conducive for future assaults both to the north and to the south. And then over here you could see additional advances by the Russian forces through the forested region west of Sinkivka. It's an advance that amounts to 3.9 nearly square kilometers, and at most it is an advance of 3 kilometers. So it is important to note this, because it means that the Russians are finally solidifying themselves in an area that's been really difficult for them, because Ukrainian DRGs, and not a large amount, it just is very low cost, but you just could have these very small harassment squads that cross over the river and continually put pressure onto Liman, Perishi, and Snikivka. So now the Russian forces have successfully cleared out those areas and taken over the forested areas, taken over dugouts, and advance southwards, which means that there's going to be a lot of direct pressure onto the northern outskirts of Kupiansk. Right now, they're only about 1.7 kilometers away, and you have this massive armory region that they are approaching, I believe. So you have that to keep an eye out for, and also, of course, the northern houses that include paved routes that then can be utilized to directly reach the Ukrainian lines of defense and suburbs like Petropavlivka and Kucherivka. Now, in relation to Kursk, we're going to look at two videos today. One of them came out of Cherkasskoye Porechnoye, and this indicates that there may actually be fighting in the village itself, not to the northwest or northeast, I should say, which is where I previously had the line of contact marked, so you can secure the geolocation from October 20th. The 1st Battalion of the 80th Air Assault Brigade is operating around here, which means that, I believe 2nd and 3rd, those are the other ones, they are operating further west, perhaps in the region near Lyubimovka, where you had the large-scale Ukrainian retreat, of course, now consolidating around Malaya Loknaya. And the 1st Battalion, they released footage of their infantry fighting vehicles making it into the center of the town and then firing towards what will probably be Russian targets, including near this tree line over here, perhaps, and also in some of the residential areas, which does mean that there probably is house-to-house fighting over here. But I would like to see more proof from Russian sources or from footage of Russian troops actually inside, because I didn't see any in the video. All I saw were infantry fighting vehicles from the Ukrainian side firing into certain targets. But yeah, I'll probably change this marking for the next video. Just keep that in mind, because we looked at advances launched by the Russian forces near the south, near Ruskaya Konopelka, which of course was important. We saw really massive Russian advances to the west, all the way to Leonidovo. What we didn't see were really efforts at this particular village, which is very important. It serves as one of the main Ukrainian frontline nodes, and taking it over will then cut off access so that the Ukrainians have to Ruskoye Porechnoye and put even more strain onto the wider salient in the northern part of the Kursk front. So that would be under a lot of threats. It would also then give the Russians a direct route through paved roads and through tree lines to make it all the way to the northern outskirts of Suja. And again, you're just looking at so many areas that could be taken over by Russia that then can converge in Suja. That's a double-edged sword, because originally the Ukrainians, they used Suja for that reason, and now the opposite is happening. Now the Russians are really taking advantage of the Ukrainians being spread out and continually retreating, not having enough wherewithal to withstand various axes of Russian attacks. And that multifaceted approach is then allowing the Russians to close in on Suja from several axes because of how well connected it is. Now looking a bit to the west, you can see some archival footage. It's a couple of days old now. It's not from here. It's from the location just to the north, or actually just to the east of Lyubimovka. It's from 9 men from the 36th Marine Brigade. Again, a very important unit, previously operated around Kherson, then around Vovchansk, and then moved to here. So they were sent in to act as a vanguard force as the rest of the Ukrainian squads retreated southwards across Tolstoy Lug and across the paved road that makes its way all the way to Sverdlikovo and Suja. So the 9 men, they were not really expecting to survive. They called in artillery strikes, including cluster munitions, on their own positions, again, to help them, help the other men get out. But by some chance, they were actually able to survive those strikes and made it out of the attempted Russian encirclement. And then we're also able to retreat along the same routes along the particular road over here. But that's just more evidence proving that the Russians were able to force the Ukrainians out, nearly encircle them in many cases, and create a very deep spear that then forced the Ukrainians out of Tolstoy Lug, Pokrovsky. And again, we're still continuing to look for additional footage from these 3 villages that are on the eastern bank of this river over here. It's very important to see whether or not the Ukrainians remain here. And although Russian sources really do insist that it was taken over, I'm being very cautious with my claims until we see geolocated footage or the Ukrainians come out admitting to it, because the implications of such a fall of these 3 villages will be very significant. It would mean the Russians have much more domination of this road over here, which would include reaching Sverdlikovo itself, putting pressure onto one of the key conduits between Sumy and Kursk oblasts, and then, of course, on the route to Suja from the rear. So it is very, very important to get new information from this region. And that's all I have for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.